Breaking. Just in. This changes everything. Overnight, the balance shifted, and almost nobody saw it coming. What was supposed to be a show of strength has turned into something far more dangerous for Washington. A clear signal that the pressure campaign failed. Not slowly, not quietly, but decisively. Nobody expected this. The tariff threat was meant to force alignment. It was designed to corner allies, to remind them where real economic gravity still lives. Instead, it triggered a choice, and Germany and Sweden made that choice without hesitation. They didn't bend, they didn't bargain, they walked, and they chose Canada. Let's be very clear about what just happened. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not a temporary workaround. This was a strategic pivot by two of Europe's most disciplined, forward-thinking economies, and they didn't do it out of emotion. They did it because the signal coming from Washington was no longer strength. It was instability. Overnight, the balance shifted. Donald Trump's tariff threat was framed as leverage, as inevitability, as pressure that no ally could realistically resist. The assumption was simple: Europe would complain, posture, and ultimately comply. That assumption is now dead. Germany saw the risk. Sweden confirmed it, and together they acted. What makes this moment historic isn't the tariff itself, it's the reaction to it, because reactions reveal perception, and the perception is no longer that Washington is the safest bet. This changes everything because once allies start planning around you instead of with you, your leverage evaporates. Tariffs don't scare partners who have already decided to leave the room. And that decision happened faster than anyone anticipated. There was no dramatic announcement, no emotional rhetoric, just quiet coordination, closed-door talks, and a cold calculation. Continued dependence on a tariff-driven United States is a liability. Canada, by contrast, offered predictability, stability, and most importantly, an absence of threats. That contrast matters. For years, the U.S. relied on its market size as a gravitational force. The idea was that no one could realistically opt out. Germany and Sweden just proved that assumption wrong. Nobody expected this because Washington didn't think an alternative would be chosen so openly, so cleanly, so fast. But the moment the tariff threat crossed from tactic into pattern, the calculation changed. Overnight, this wasn't defiance, it was risk management, and that's what makes it so dangerous for the side issuing the threat. You can punish defiance. You cannot easily reverse strategic withdrawal. The message sent by Germany and Sweden is subtle but devastating. Pressure no longer equals control. In fact, pressure now accelerates exit. This changes everything because the rest of Europe is watching, Asia is watching, markets are watching, and once it's clear that alignment with Washington is optional, the entire structure of leverage starts to crack. This isn't about Canada winning, it's about the United States losing something it assumed was permanent. Overnight, the balance shifted, and the shock hasn't even fully landed yet. Here's where the story gets uncomfortable, because the escalation didn't happen all at once. It happened in layers, and every layer made the outcome more inevitable. The tariff threat wasn't a single moment. It was a drumbeat, repeated, reinforced, reframed, each time presented as necessary, as unavoidable as the cost of doing business with the United States. And each time, the message was the same: comply or face consequences. At first, Germany and Sweden treated it like noise. They've seen this before. Rhetoric hardens, negotiations follow, tempers cool. That's how it's always worked. But this time, something felt different. The language wasn't signaling negotiation, it was signaling permanence. Not leverage for a deal, but pressure as a standing condition. And that's when the escalation began to backfire. Behind closed doors, the questions shifted. Not how do we respond, but how exposed are we? Not can this be resolved, but what happens if it isn't? Those are dangerous questions for any pressure campaign, because once allies start thinking long-term, threats lose their bite. Washington kept tightening the tone: less flexibility, fewer off-ramps, more certainty that tariffs were coming one way or another. The idea was to force a decision under pressure, and it worked, just not the way it was intended. Germany didn't counter-threaten. Sweden didn't grandstand. There were no dramatic ultimatums thrown back across the Atlantic. Instead, there was silence. And silence, in moments like this, is never passive. Every escalation from Washington was met with preparation elsewhere. Supply chains were reviewed, dependencies mapped, contingencies activated. The pressure campaign assumed resistance would be loud and confrontational. Instead, it was methodical, clinical, almost invisible. And that's how escalation fails, because when pressure is expected, it stops being effective. It becomes a variable. something to be managed, not feared. The repetition mattered. Every time tariffs were framed as inevitable, the cost-benefit calculation changed. If punishment is guaranteed regardless of cooperation, then cooperation loses its value. That realization spread quickly. Germany understood that waiting was riskier than moving. Sweden reached the same conclusion, not because they wanted confrontation, but because escalation without an exit strategy leaves only one rational response: disengagement. Canada didn't escalate. That's the key detail Washington underestimated. While the rhetoric hardened in the US, Canada stayed predictable, quiet, available, no threats, no conditions wrapped in dominance, just consistency. And in an environment of constant escalation, consistency becomes leverage. The escalation narrative assumed allies would blink first. Instead, they adapted. They treated tariffs not as a shock, but as a constant, and constants can be planned around. That's when the decision solidified. By the time Washington realized the pressure wasn't producing concessions, it was already producing exits. Not dramatic exits, structural ones, the kind that don't make headlines until they're impossible to reverse. Escalation only works if the other side believes relief is possible. The moment that belief disappears, pressure stops being a weapon and starts being a signal to leave. And Germany and Sweden received that signal loud and clear. This wasn't a breakdown in talks. It was the collapse of an assumption that escalation equals control. It doesn't. It equals acceleration. And acceleration is exactly what happened next. Now the story moves into the heart of the struggle. The power play. This is where strength isn't measured by rhetoric, and leverage isn't measured by tariffs. It's about influence, control, and who dictates the rules of engagement when the stakes are highest. Trump's strategy was supposed to signal dominance: loud threats, market pressure, unilateral decision-making, all designed to project authority and remind allies who's in charge. But here's the catch: dominance only works if the other side stays in the arena. If allies start calculating around you, control slips through your fingers like sand. Germany and Sweden understood this immediately. They didn't respond with spectacle. They responded with strategy: quiet consultations, measured assessments, and a recalibration of their global partnerships. The key move: pivoting toward Canada, a nation overlooked by Washington, underestimated for its stability and predictability. In the shadow of threats, Canada became the anchor they needed. And that shift exposes a critical truth about power. It is not simply about forcing decisions. It is about shaping choices so that others want to align with you. When pressure turns into unpredictability, the partner most dependent on your market or goodwill loses trust. And with trust lost, influence evaporates. Trump's leverage, once considered near absolute, is now compromised. Allies aren't merely resisting, they are reclaiming control. The United States thought it was moving the board, but the board had already shifted under Europe's feet. The maneuver by Germany and Sweden is subtle but brutal. It's not a rebellion, it's a calculated reclamation of agency. They are choosing their partners, allocating risk, and repositioning influence, all while the United States is still stuck in the old playbook of coercion. Every action in Washington, every tweet, every statement about tariffs now carries a double meaning. It reveals not strength, but desperation. The facade of control is cracking, and even the boldest statements can't mask that some pieces on the global chessboard are no longer under U.S. influence. Canada's role is central. Its reliability contrasts sharply with unpredictability across the Atlantic. The power of quiet, consistent partnership becomes evident when contrasted with loud, conditional threats. In this context, Canada is not passive. It is an instrument of influence that absorbs alignment without demanding compliance, and allies notice. For Washington, the consequence is stark. One side is trying to assert dominance through pressure, while the other side is consolidating power through choice. And in strategic terms, the side choosing is winning. Germany and Sweden are exercising power by diversifying alliances, hedging risk, and recalibrating influence, all while the United States loses its grip. The lesson is unavoidable. Coercion may command attention, but attraction commands alignment. Power today is about shaping the environment so that others voluntarily remain in your orbit. When the environment is dominated by unpredictability, no amount of tariffs can force loyalty. Trump's power play, intended to consolidate control, is now a cautionary tale. A move designed to bend allies instead revealed the limits of leverage, and the consequences extend far beyond one trade dispute. When influence is lost quietly, structurally, it leaves no dramatic announcement, only the slow, inexorable shift of the global balance. And this shift is happening right now. Now we confront the fallout, and make no mistake, the consequences of this realignment are massive. The shift from Washington to Ottawa is not just a diplomatic hiccup, it is a structural tremor that ripples across economics, politics, and global strategy. The first wave hits economic confidence. When Germany and Sweden pivot to Canada, supply chains begin to recalibrate, contracts are reviewed, long-term investments are reconsidered, predictable partnerships suddenly have a new standard, reliability over rhetoric. Companies, investors, and industries that relied on U.S. stability now face uncertainty. That uncertainty is quiet but powerful. It doesn't make headlines immediately, but it changes behavior. Decisions are delayed, deals are renegotiated, risk premiums rise. This is the economic shockwave nobody in Washington wants to admit. The second wave is political. The tariff threat was supposed to enforce obedience, to remind allies of the consequences of resistance. Instead, it undermines confidence in U.S. leadership. Allies see a pattern, unpredictability, escalation, and pressure without resolution. Political fallout grows silently. Across capitals in Europe, and even in multilateral institutions, policymakers start hedging their bets, recalibrating loyalties, and quietly shifting alliances. The U.S. is no longer the only safe harbor, and in international politics, perception often carries more weight than reality. The third wave is strategic. By choosing Canada, Germany and Sweden signal that alternatives exist. This is a wake-up call not just for Washington, but for global actors observing the US's approach. The lesson is unmistakable. Leverage is conditional. Coercion only works when dependence is unchallenged. When partners realize they have options, the structure of power begins to crack. Canada's rise is quiet but telling. In moments of pressure, predictability is more persuasive than force. And then there is the subtle, long-term consequence: credibility. Once lost, it cannot be easily regained. Every future policy, every new threat, every new negotiation carries the shadow of this moment. Allies remember the pivot, the quiet resistance, the choice to exit the orbit of coercion. That memory shapes the calculus of future alignments. Trust eroded today becomes hesitation tomorrow, and hesitation is power's silent enemy. The consequences don't end there. They extend to domestic perception as well. Policymakers and advisors in Washington are forced to confront a bitter truth. Tactics that produce headlines may not produce results. Public confidence in strategy begins to wobble. The narrative of dominance, so central to the political playbook, is undercut by actions that prove otherwise. Every statement defending tariffs now exists in tension with the reality that leverage is slipping. Finally, this moment introduces a structural crisis. Not dramatic, not explosive, but inexorable. Economic shockwaves, political fallout, and strategic recalibration converge. The system adapts quietly, shifting loyalties, redirecting partnerships, and redefining influence. What was assumed to be permanent, the primacy of U.S. influence, is now negotiable. Allies have shown they can move, and that realization has consequences that extend far beyond the immediate tariffs. In short, the moment Germany and Sweden chose Canada is not merely a policy decision. It is a warning, a sign that the levers of power are no longer absolute, that the very foundation of influence depends not on threats but on trust. And once trust is questioned, the reverberations are unavoidable. Massive consequences, economic shockwaves, political fallout, all unfolding silently but relentlessly. The crisis is structural, the crisis is ongoing, and the storm is only beginning to hit the shores of Washington. Now we step into the unknown, the aftermath, and the looming questions that no one in Washington wants to answer openly. Make no mistake, this isn't over, far from it. The pivot by Germany and Sweden toward Canada is only the opening chapter in what promises to be a prolonged strategic recalibration. The next move will define everything. Washington faces a choice, and it is a stark one. Double down on pressure, escalate tariffs even further, and risk alienating allies permanently, or recalibrate, acknowledge that leverage has shifted, and attempt to rebuild credibility. Both paths are fraught with peril. One risks intensifying departures, the other demands restraint, patience, and humility, qualities often scarce in moments dominated by political spectacle. Every option carries consequences that ripple far beyond trade lines. Meanwhile, Europe watches closely. Germany and Sweden have sent a signal that is both subtle and unambiguous. Alignment is no longer coerced, it is chosen. That lesson is now part of the strategic calculus for every ally, every investor, every global actor who once assumed the U.S. market was an unshakable anchor. Dependence has limits, and once those limits are tested, the realignment accelerates. Canada's quiet emergence as the preferred alternative underscores a profound shift in influence. Predictability, reliability, and strategic patience have proven more effective than threats and ultimatums. And that is a lesson that will reverberate across multiple theaters of power. Allies will now weigh the risk of unilateral U.S. action against the stability offered elsewhere. And when that calculus favors alternatives, influence quietly migrates, often faster than anyone can react. The stakes are now higher than simple tariffs. This is about credibility, about trust, about whether Washington can still anchor global expectations, or whether it is increasingly seen as a volatile actor, capable of sudden policy swings that disrupt markets, alliances, and long term planning. The repercussions are structural. They will shape decisions, investments, and partnerships long after the headlines fade. One thing is clear: the story is far from concluded. Every subsequent statement, every new policy initiative, every public pronouncement will be measured against this moment. Allies will remember the quiet decision to pivot. Competitors will note the cracks. And domestic observers will scrutinize the inability of pressure to produce alignment. This isn't the end of U.S. influence. But it is a warning, a signal that the era of unquestioned leverage may be over, that choices once assumed permanent can now be recalibrated, and that the next moves, in Washington, in Europe, and in Ottawa, will carry the weight of history. Every decision from here on will be scrutinized, tested, and judged in the shadow of this pivotal moment. The realignment is underway, the clock is ticking, and the next move will define everything. This isn't over, not by a long shot. The Allies have spoken with their actions, and the world is watching closely to see how the center of gravity responds. The stakes are immense, the implications historic, and the consequences will echo for years to come.